welcome back to the channel. Today, we're leaving the M cars to the side here and working on this N52. We already did the stage 3 intake manifold on it, and now we're gonna be doing the oil pan gasket. We're gonna install some headers. So, first thing we're gonna need to do is support the motor from the top here. Should do the pan gaskets because we're gonna drop the subframe. So, put the tow hook right through there, and we'll have the engine brace on the top right there to hold it. You can weasel the headers in without taking the subframe off, but for demonstration and ease of install, plus doing the pan gasket, if you're watching this, your N52 probably needs a pan gasket. So just take the subframe off and do them both at the same time. Save yourself labor in the future. But if you're watching this just for the pan gasket, then here we go. Tow hook installed. All right, engine support is installed. It's on there nice and tight. Try to avoid on some, especially like X5s, X3s, E92 335s, but they'll have the plastic fender deal here. And there'll be a big gap, so then when you put the support on there, you could risk cracking the fender on that side. This side, there wasn't any place solid, like right here, but there's not quite as big a gap, so this one is not gonna be quite under so much tension. But now that we have the brace installed, time to raise it up and drain the oil. We're gonna be like, hopefully your car is like this one. It has all of the covers underneath. Very nice, especially if you're trying to conceal a leak. But it's pretty much just like any other BMW, all 8mm. There may be a 10 in there, but looks like on the little 128 here, it's all 8s. Main engine cover is off. So technically you don't have to remove the transmission cover here, whether you're doing the subframe or the oil pan gasket, both. But even though we have the engine brace up top, and you guys have probably seen it before, it's nice to have a support right here, whether you're doing it on the ground and have a jack there, or in this case on a lift and use a screw jack. It's nice to have that second layer of support. So we'll take the transmission cover off too. All right, transmission cover off. All right, now we can see some things. So one thing to note is this is a rear wheel drive car, so no axles to deal with, no front diff to deal with. Pretty much the perfect BMW, kind of like that one or this one, and these two guys over there. So, yeah, we can get right to it. Next thing to do, drain the oil. So while the oil is draining out here, I'm gonna go up top and make sure that the steering wheel is straight and then put a seatbelt through it. It's a good practice when doing anything that involves disconnecting the steering shaft from the rack is getting the steering wheel where you want it to be, whether it be straight or off to the side, whatever is easiest to get to the steering shaft bolt. And then taking the seatbelt here, running it through the steering wheel into the other half of the seatbelt. So you're gonna run the seatbelt through the steering wheel into the seatbelt latch there, just so it doesn't move when it's disconnected, because you don't want to be off by 180 or anywhere near that. And then you go to turn it to the left or to the right, you pop the clock spring inside, airbag lights on, customer's not happy, you're not happy. Just run the seatbelt through the steering wheel. So there, we have tension on the wheel with the seatbelt, and we have the wheel where we need it so we can access the steering shaft bolt. Down to the steering shaft we go. So looking right through here, there's the steering shaft bolt. You can access it through this hole right here in the subframe. It's an E10, so if you have a 1/4-inch E10, it fits right through. If you have a 3/8 E10, it does not fit through and you get a smaller E10. If you look through here, so going right through the hole in the subframe, we can see access to the steering shaft bolt. Nice. All right, before we disconnect the shaft from the rack, we're gonna put a mark on it just in case, so if things do go awry, we'll know where it was. Do note though, that this black collar right here has a little alignment portion on it. Not all BMWs have this, some of them are broken, so it's still a good idea to do the seat belt and then also mark the shaft itself. But in reality, as long as this shaft doesn't move and you don't move the rack, you should just be able to slide it right back on and not even need an alignment. But you should still do it the proper way. All right, now the steering shaft bolt is out and we have it marked. We need to get the shaft off the rack, so we're gonna lightly tap it with a pry bar. Don't hit the joint, like the little U-joint in the middle here. Try to get a good flat spot, like right there, for instance. Or you could even go up here. There's another one. So light taps, and it should come right off. Now I'll put the drain plug back into the pan so you can move whatever oil catching device you used. Get a little bit more room. If you're somebody that is really into preventative maintenance, now would be a good time for the water pump right here. And this little U hose, N52, N54, N55, they all have this U hose and electric water pump. If your valve cover's leaking, it takes out that hose. They make it in metal now, good upgrade. And while the subframe's out, it makes water pump and thermostat a lot easier to get to. All right, so at this point, now the steering shaft is disconnected, and we looked, this does not have active steering. If it did, there'd be a little arm connected to the control arm here, an electrical connector. We don't have that on either side. There's also nothing else really connecting the two as far as the subframe and the chassis goes. These power steering lines here, sometimes you have to disconnect them, sometimes you don't. It just kind of depends on the setup. If it's a E92 M3, you will want to take the power steering lines off their holders, but in this situation, we're going to move right to supporting the transmission just as a backup, because again, we do have the engine brace up top, but we don't drop a motor, so this is how. All right, with the engine supported not once, but twice, we can start loosening up the subframe bolts. They're 18 millimeters, it'll be 3 on each side, so 1, 2, 3, and then it's a mirror image, so 1, 2, and 3. So to start, we're gonna break them loose, not take them all the way out, just so we get a little bit of gap evenly from side to side. See how it's dropping down, and then we'll disconnect the sway bar link from the sway bar right here on the bottom. What's nice about the 128 in particular, and a lot of BMWs will vary on the chassis, F-Series, it's very typical to have the mount bolts come through right here. And so since the steering shaft is disconnected, all we need to do is support the transmission. Even though we do have the engine brace up top, and then we can continue loosening the subframe bolts. We're gonna leave the control arms attached to the subframe and drop it like an E92 M3, for instance. So we should be able just to drop the subframe down a little bit, and then we'll get to all the oil pan bolts, get the pan off, get the gasket replaced, stop the oil leak. Let's get to removing some bolts. Now that the motor mounts are disconnected and we have a little bit of support underneath the subframe, we can continue loosening the subframe bolts. I am leaving them threaded just a little bit. Here's with the subframe fully disconnected. See this alignment dowel here? Should have to get down far enough to get past that for the front. The middle does not have one, either does the rear. But with this much clearance between the subframe and the oil pan, at this point, we should be able to undo the oil pan bolts and drop the pan down far enough that we can get it slid out and replace the gasket. The oil pan bolts are E12s also, same as the motor mount bolts. I'm gonna take them out with a impact here, 3/8 extensions, just for speed. Of course, when we put them back together, we're not just going to impact them on, we'll torque them down to spec, but for the removal process, this is the way to go. It's highly recommended when doing an N54, N52, basically any BMW oil pan that has aluminum bolts, to replace these bolts. If you try to reuse them, you are going to have a leak. So, just another little tip for you. And some bolts, like, wow, how am I gonna get to that? That one up there. Well, right through this hole in the subframe. That's how. Need a longer extension. Come on. This is in 4K. Going through the subframe to get to the bolts, just with a little bit longer extension. All right, so at this point, all of the bolts are out for the oil pan, except these two here. As you can see, can't really get to them with the setup of just the E12 socket and the extension. So what I'm doing is switching over and putting the E12 on a little wobble here. So I can reach up in there like so, making sure it's fully on the bolt. And then you go through the subframe on this one. Now the pan is loose, we can get to the gasket here. The only thing I also would suggest would be take this 10mm off for the ground. After that, we'll be able to get the pan all the way out. Also, I'd like to note that most BMWs have an aluminum pan, and they have bolts that come through the bell housing to hold it on. So if you do have one of those, make sure before you support the transmission, depending on where you support it at, you can still have access to the bolts. Go through there. There should be 4 of them. You get 10mm, get this disconnected. We'll get the pan out and get it cleaned up. So with the pan out, now is a good time to make sure you don't have chunks of chain guides in the pan. A lot of BMWs, the N52s, the N20s, all like to break the chain guides, timing, and then they end up in the bottom of the pan. So we will go dump all of this oil out, get it cleaned up in the solvent tank, and then we will clean up the gasket surface right here for the oil pan gasket to go onto. I want that to be clean, dry, and smooth, along with the sealing surface on the block here. So if somebody's done the pan before, make sure they didn't put like RTV or anything like that on there. These should go together dry. Also a good time to check the oil pump chain here. Make sure that it has the proper tension. We can't really see anything as far as the timing chain goes. I mean, you can see it, yeah, but can't really get in there and do anything as far as feeling it for tension. Get the pan cleaned up. We'll get ready to reassemble. This is not part of the oil pan gasket DIY, but while you're in here, anytime you're dropping the subframe down, if you haven't replaced your motor mounts in a while, or you don't know the condition, pretty good idea to replace them, because at this point, since they're disconnected on one side, it goes into the subframe. It's not too bad to put a 17mm up there, break them loose, and replace the motor mounts. Save yourself a lot of time in the future, and if you're having a shop do it, you'll save a lot of money because they won't have to pull the subframe and loosen it up at all. You're already here. Like for instance, we're not charging the customer, put the motor mounts in. It's gonna take a few minutes to do both with everything disconnected right here. So talk to the shop that you're gonna have do your repair if you're not doing it yourself, and see if they'll hook you up with that. So a tip, let's get back to the oil pan. All right, so we got the pan all cleaned up. Got some zip ties through it to hold the gasket in place. Now we just gotta slide it up in the hole. So as you can see here, got the bolts started, except for the ones that have zip ties through it. They're not up there tight or anything. I'm gonna throw it away, there's a gap actually between the pan and the bolts, so that we can still move the zip tie and cut it. So once you have them all started, except for the ones that have the zip ties through, you can cut them and then you can snug them all up, like finger tight or hand tight, and then we'll begin the torque sequence. Snip at it. All right, now that all the pan bolts are snug against the pan, we can torque them. There's not an actual sequence from BMW on this. It's just a torque spec, which is 8 Nm plus 90 degrees. So we're gonna do kind of like a traditional torque sequence would be. We start in the middle, work our way out both ways, and going back and forth between each side. And then once they're all torqued, we'll go back through, just verify that they're all torqued again. A lot of times you'll torque them, and then if we go back through, you'll find that a few have loosened up. So always good to just verify and be sure, so you don't have to come in here and do it again. All right, we're back up top here. Got the engine brace off, got oil in it. Everything's torqued to spec. So let's start it up, see what it sounds like. So there you have it, guys. It's not too bad a job. It's definitely possible to do this job in your driveway. It may not be the most fun. Hopefully this helps some of you guys out. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe. And thanks for watching.